Well, we're back with our international correspondent, Alex Newman. And Alex, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Duke. Great to be with you.
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it, how homeschooling is front and center now, particularly in the progressives' mind. Long before COVID-19, the progressives were slowly trying to establish a framework in which they can attack homeschooling. You don't put 60 million American school kids into something as restrictive and regulated as Common Core and then leave moms and dads free to homeschool their kids. We knew that from the beginning. But I think COVID now radically accelerated the anti-homeschool movement precisely because moms and dads have to homeschool. And so John Stossel, the Daily Signal, had a nice segment on what's wrong with homeschooling? Why now are these educrats going after homeschooling? Tell us what you think about explain the argument that Stossel makes, and tell me what you think of the program.
Yeah, well, thank you, Duke. And it's actually a very similar argument to what we have been making here on the Dr. Duke Show and also at the Newman Report at Freedom Project. And we even had a cover story in the New American very recently, Coronavirus Opens Eyes to Homeschooling. And, it's becoming very obvious now to conservatives, to liberals, to progressives, to homeschoolers, to anti-homeschoolers, that this coronavirus is going to be an enormous boost to homeschooling. I mean, if we don't get millions of new homeschoolers just in the United States as a result of this coronavirus lockdown, I'll be very, very surprised. We have polls showing somewhere between 25 to 40% of government school moms and dads are now thinking about pulling their children out and homeschooling or moving over to, online programs like Freedom Project Academy. The public school system can be decimated by this. And I think that is, as John Stossel explained, the big silver lining, right? The government schools have been responsible for the social control, for the progressive indoctrination. I mean, you have Mike Pompeo talking about this now. You have the president talking about this. We got to rescue our children from failing schools. We've got Franklin Graham calling on parents to pull their children out of the public school system. This is now as mainstream as it can be. And so the other side, the people who want to use the public schools to brainwash America's children are freaking out, and for good reason. So we're going to see a huge battle going forward here.
I love your use of the word decimated, which is, of course, Latin for 1 in 10. To decimate in the old Roman army was to kill 1 out of 10 prisoners or 1 out of 10 rebels. And so if we got 10%, the tithe, right? If we got 10% of 60 million school kids to homeschool, that's 6 million kids. Mike, show the first video we've got on this.
Parents and guardians forced into full-time homeschooling.
Listening to the media, you'd think that's a terrible thing that will set back a generation of children.
The longer these shutdowns last, the more students will fall behind, and the harder it will be to get them back where they need to be.
But in fact,
the evidence overwhelmingly shows that children who are homeschooled get much better academic and social results than kids in government schools.
If the American public schools were really concerned about making your kid the best mathematician he could be, the most literate, well-written, well-spoken person he can be, if the schools were concerned about making your kids college-ready in a serious intellectual way, they would welcome homeschooling, especially if it was helping kids get there, right? So why are they all so angry? It's what you and I have been saying for a decade now. It's because the primary focus of American public schools is not educational literacy. It's not making your kids the best they can be academically. It's about ideology and social programming. The one thing that parents can't, because they won't do when they homeschool, they won't socially indoctrinate kids along progressive atheist material lines. That's what's got them angry.
That's exactly right, Duke. They're concerned. The Babylon Bee, I think, did an excellent satire on this. They said that college professors were concerned that all these homeschool kids were coming in and they weren't proficient yet in gender studies. And that's exactly what's going on here, right? They're worried that moms and dads aren't going to be teaching kindergarten children that they can mutilate their genitals and be a new gender. And so what's going to happen on the other side of this is, the story of the child who pointed out the emperor has no clothes. It just takes a few to slip through the cracks and point out, hey, that emperor is naked. And suddenly everybody else, looks around and says, oh my goodness, he really is naked, and we can say that. That's what they're freaking out about. That's why we see the Harvard push to ban homeschooling. That's why we see all these progressives coming down, all these fake media outlets demonizing homeschoolers. We just did an article about World Vision joining an anti-homeschooling coalition in Brazil. Very, very troubling. And so this is going to be a big, big battle going forward, Duke, and homeschoolers and homeschool advocates need to prepare.
Yep, and Mom and Dad, there's no clearer evidence that you see what it's like. You can teach your kids read. You can take your kid on the internet to really good history sites. You know that your kid has a mind that wants to learn. What are they so threatened about? Because you're actually doing real education and the public schools are not. We'll pick this up, Alex, on the other side of the break. Alex, I can't think of a better example of this, again, from the Stossel program, than this little educational ogre who lives under the bridge of education. Take a look at this guy and try not to sneer openly.
The kids aren't learning in the government schools.
Listen, that's true. We don't have as effective civic education as we should.
So maybe parents will do better.
But the problem is there's no effective regulation to even know what's going on.
You sound like you think because there's a regulation, that makes something happen.
I do, and I think that if you have a situation like homeschooling, where there's no regulation, that's a worse situation.
And this is the key. I mean, this little man, he admits openly that they're not learning in the public schools, but his response is, we need regulations over education. To regulate is to clamp down. It is to destroy diversity. To regulate is to get one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter education. It's exactly what Common Core people wanted. And, he reminds me, this guy, of Dr. Fauci, right? It's this idea. Let's just use the metaphor, right? Let's like the analogy of COVID. And so on the one hand, you've got states like Tennessee and Georgia that are opening up for business. People are going about their work. And guess what? No really further problems. But along comes the Faucis of the world. Along comes this little education troll and says, no. It doesn't matter how many people die from not being able to work. It doesn't matter how many suicides in a San Francisco hospital now. There are more suicides over lockdowns than there are actually COVID deaths. We need regulation for regulation's sake. Is that not the definition of mindless socialist government? Regulation before everything else.
You would almost think that was a parody of an anti-homeschooling advocate because it's just so ludicrous, Duke. And first of all, he's being very dishonest. The idea that there's no regulation on homeschoolers is preposterous. I can tell you as a homeschooler, we have more than enough regulation. Every year we got to submit papers, we got to submit to testing. It's absolute baloney. There's a handful of liberal states, interestingly, where there's not too much homeschool regulation. But in my opinion, there's far too much. And the second point, I think what you said about diversity is crucial here. These progressives will blabber about diversity until they're blue in the face. But when you actually talk to them, they hate diversity. They hate the idea that children might grow up with different ideas and might pursue different interests and might have different educational strategies from parents with different worldviews. They want everybody, every last child in this country and on the planet to fit into their little cookie-cutter, brainwashed progressive mold that they hope to use to empower their future, single-party state, basically, right? It's absolutely crazy. And when these people talk about diversity, we should rub it right back in their faces. We are the advocates of diversity. Parents should have the freedom to educate their children in a diverse manner, right? That's not what they want. It's the same thing on college campuses, as you know very well, Duke. They talk about diversity, but they don't really mean diversity in terms of what people believe, in terms of, right? You'll never find an outspoken conservative, for the most part, with a handful of exceptions, on college campuses today. If they can stop it, they will, because they hate actual diversity.
Well, regulation, let's go back to this regulation issue. I mean, my God, look at how hyper-regulated teachers are. Look at how boxed in teachers are because of these endless regulations from the local districts all the way up to the federal government, what they can and can't do, how they're allowed to do it, what they're being forced to do, whether they want to do it or not. I want to teach elementary school math. I don't want to teach transgenderism to math students in elementary school. Tough, you're going to do it. Think about what regulation has done to absolutely strangle teachers. The good ones have all walked away. The remaining ones now realize that they're not actually teachers, they're facilitators. And if the government gets their way, they're going to regulate teachers right out of the classroom. We did a story last week about how the UN wants to get rid of teachers all together. This is the consequence of regulation. Alex, we got about a minute left. Give me your last thoughts on this.
Yeah, Duke, again, I'll emphasize that I think homeschooling advocates, homeschool parents need to be prepared for an enormous battle ahead. They're laying the groundwork now. If you go into your favorite search engine and type in child abuse reports are down, and that's not good, you'll find similar propaganda puff pieces published in almost every state. They're laying the groundwork for a major assault on educational freedom because they know they really stepped in it here with this school lockdown. So we have got to be prepared to defend our rights as parents, as free human beings, to educate our children in the way we see best. It's going to be crucial, and it's going to come fast and furious in the months ahead.
And the thing that gets me is they're using children's rights, this invented new little category, right? Children's law. And they actually say, Alex, Every child is entitled to a good public school education, which means we can't let parents homeschool. And yet, by their own definition, the little ogre under the bridge said it. They're not getting a good public school education. You've already violated the premise on which you're attacking homeschool. Maybe if you could prove kids were getting an actually effective public school education, maybe then you wouldn't need homeschooling. But they can't see the forest for their own ideological trees. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back again next week.